Okay, so here I'm showing you how I'm just sketching out very lightly two different planes, a background and a foreground. And that's really all we're going to need on this particular landscape. Because next what we're going to do is mix up our colors and do a two-color wash. So I'm just kind of using some of the colors that are in my palette, purple and a red. So just like we did in our other tutorial. And I'm going to put a little bit of yellow down there in the center while that's still wet. We're going to let that dry. And I'm moving on to the next landscape while my first one is drying, and I'm kind of building upon the same idea of sketching out a few different planes, except I'm doing a lot more this time, just to where it looks more like a mountain scene. So you can kind of keep expanding upon that if you want to. And I'm going to do the same technique for the sky. Just do a simple wash and just bring that down to your pencil line. Alright, so now that both of those skies are dry, which is what we want, we can now start to paint the landscape. And the landscape is going to be just another wash as well. It's just going to be the color that we want our landscape. So I'm going to do some greens and do some blues and grays along with some of those on my next landscape. So I'm just mixing up my color there in my palette. I'm going to use a lot of the greens, so I'm kind of mixing that up there for myself. And you initially want to paint this wash on your landscape fairly light. So you can kind of see it's about the same value as the sky. And I'm going over both areas, the foreground and the background. And there's a reason why we're going to do that, is because we're going to let that dry completely and then come back over it with a darker, more opaque version of that color. So while we wait for that to dry, I am doing the landscape on the next one, except I'm using two colors this time. So I'm using a little bit more of a gray blue in the background and green down at the bottom. So I'm kind of mixing up my green there and see how much darker that is for the foreground versus the background color. And I'm just adding in a little extra darkness there in the top, kind of giving it more texture too, so maybe it kind of looks like trees. And then I'm just going to take a little bit of that leftover kind of watery paint and sort of add a little bit more to the background there, just to give it some kind of shadows and shading on it. Alright, and then moving on to the next landscape, I'm actually going to just be painting in those areas. It's kind of going to be like a puzzle actually, how you're going to paint it, but you're going to want to wait for each one of those areas to dry before you paint the next one, because it will be wet and you'll actually need to wait for it to finish up. So I'm going to do some clouds, and clouds are going to need to be a very light kind of wash, and you can use your round brush for those. And there's no really, shape or form necessarily. I kind of like to mix it up with some more puffy kind of shapes with some more linear shapes. But you just want to keep those fairly light. You can add a little bit of shadow to them while they're still wet. Using the wet on wet technique for clouds is really great. So now I'm just going to kind of start filling in the rest of my more mountain landscape. And you want to switch up your color and your opacity on those. So I'm just kind of doing that, and then I'm painting some really light clouds in that sky because I want to focus more on the landscape. So here's where I'm kind of coming in with a much darker color, and I'm making sure that each area is a slightly different color. Some I've mixed a little bit more of the blue green together, and then some is just the dark green, and then it's going to get a little bit lighter as I come down. But this is fun to kind of paint, almost like paint by numbers. So you can mix it up and paint whatever colors that you like in there. But I kind of like going from blue to green, just because that's kind of how it looks out in a natural landscape. The further away it is, the more kind of a blue gray color and then the closer to you, it's a little bit darker. So I'm kind of filling in a little extra area down here on the bottom that I didn't actually sketch in, but that's kind of the nice thing about the sketching lightly is that you can make these areas up as you go if you're painting. I do that all the time. I change my mind a lot when I'm painting, especially landscapes. So that's why I don't like to sketch too much or too heavy. And now that all of this is dry, or at least mostly dry, we're going to mix up a darker color for some trees. So I'm using a little bit of my burnt umber and a little Payne's gray and putting that together to get a nice dark color. Now you could use black, or you could use a really dark blue or violet, just something that's neutral, but it's going to be darker than what your landscape is because we're going to be painting over our landscape. You could also use gouache if you wanted to do something very opaque. This would be a great spot to use gouache if you wanted to. So I'm going to be doing just a couple pine trees. I'm going to stick with just 3. I like to work in odd numbers when I do trees. And I'm going to have some be a little bit taller, some a little shorter, and I'm kind of doing the same technique that I did in my Watercolor for Beginners series on trees. So if you would like a little bit more information and tutorial on how to do trees, then you can watch that video. And this is just how I like to paint pine trees, and I'm going to make each one of them just a little different. Make some a little bit fatter and some a little bit shorter. But you can mix this up and do as many trees as you want. You could just do 1 tree if you wanted. Or if you wanted to do a lot of trees, then you could do some trees in the background and trees in the foreground, and your trees that are going to be furthest away from you are going to be lighter, and your trees that are closest to you are going to be taller and darker. So kind of keep that in mind if you want to mix that up and just kind of start painting a lot of different trees. You can do that. Just kind of water your paint down a little bit more. That's going to give you a little bit more transparency. And that'll be really fun to kind of give yourself a whole forest of trees if you want. I sometimes like to do that, and then sometimes I just like to do a couple. So it's totally up to you. This is your landscape.